In the underworld, gravity is the only law that cannot be bribed. When a man goes over the edge of a 20-story building, there is no appeal process. There is only the wind, the scream, and the sudden, wet finality of the pavement. That was the rumor that hit the street at 9:42 p.m. It didn't start with a gunshot. It started with a phone call from a construction site on the west side. A watchman, shivering in the cold, whispered into a payphone that he had seen a struggle. He had seen the silhouette of 3 men in fedoras forcing a 4th man over the ledge of the steel skeleton. He said the 4th man was wearing a charcoal suit. He said the 4th man didn't scream. And just like that, the lie became the truth. The word splatter moved through Harlem faster than the A train. By 10 p.m. the story had mutated, but the ending was always the same. Bumpy Johnson was paced on the sidewalk. The king had taken flight, and the pavement had won. A strange, suffocating silence descended on 125th Street. The hustlers on the corners vanished into the shadows like roaches sensing a flashlight. The music in the clubs didn't stop, but it lost its soul. The saxophone players played softer, looking at the door, expecting the police, or worse, the vacuum. Because everyone knew that Bumpy Johnson was the dam holding back the flood. If the dam was broken, the Italians were coming to drown them all. And 3 miles south, in the back room of a cigar bar on Mulberry Street, the flood was already celebrating. The Genovese captains were clinking glasses of anisette. They were laughing. They were mocking the image of the great Bumpy Johnson flailing his arms in the empty air. They were toasting to the law of physics. They thought the problem was solved. They thought the body was already being scraped off the concrete by the coroner. They were so busy congratulating themselves on the murder that they forgot to check one small detail. They forgot to check if the body was actually there. Because while they were popping corks, a shadow was moving through the alleyways of Harlem. A shadow with torn clothes, a shadow with bleeding hands, a shadow that was very much alive and very, very angry. They thought they had dropped him to his death. Instead, they had just dropped him into his element. For 120 minutes, the city held its breath, waiting for a funeral. If you're ready to see the most violent resurrection in the history of New York, like this video. To understand the weight of the body they tried to throw off that roof, you have to understand the gravity of the man himself. Rewind the tape. Go back 6 hours, go back 6 years, it doesn't matter. The picture is always the same. Harlem, 1952. It was a kingdom built on a paradox. On the surface, it was the cultural capital of the world. It was the sound of Charlie Parker's saxophone bleeding out of the open door of the Savoy Ballroom, mixing with the diesel fumes of the crosstown bus. It was the smell of Bada's fried chicken and expensive perfume on 125th Street. It was a place where a man could shine shoes for a nickel in the morning and wear a silk suit that cost a year's wages at night. But underneath the jazz and the lights, there was a machine. A grinding, relentless machine made of paper slips and whispered numbers, the numbers game, the illegal lottery. It was the heartbeat of the neighborhood. Every maid, every porter, every dock worker put their pennies and dimes on a 3-digit number, hoping to hit big. It was a river of small change that flowed through the barbershops and beauty parlors, aggregating into a tsunami of millions of dollars. Untaxed, untraceable, pure power, and sitting at the top of the dam, controlling the floodgates, was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. He didn't look like a gangster. He didn't have the broken nose of a prize fighter or the loud mouth of a thug. He looked like a university professor who had lost his tenure for dueling. He wore charcoal suits tailored by the same men who dressed Wall Street bankers. He read Nietzsche and history books in the back of the Flash Inn. He played chess with a grandmaster's focus, moving people like pawns on a board that only he could see. But don't let the books fool you. The man carried a switchblade in his pocket and a riot in his heart. There's a story from that winter. A local stick-up kid, a junkie with more desperation than sense, tried to rob one of Bumpy's runners. He put a pistol in the old man's face and took the bag of collections. It was maybe $200. Bumpy didn't send a hit squad. He didn't scream. He simply walked into the pool hall where the kid was bragging. The room went silent, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. The click of the billiard ball stopped. The jukebox seemed to unplug itself. Bumpy walked up to the kid. He didn't pull a gun. He pulled out a folded newspaper. He sat down opposite the terrified boy and started reading the sports section. He didn't say a word. He just sat there, reading. For 10 minutes. The kid was sweating, shaking. The pistol in his waistband felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. He knew that every man in that room was waiting for a signal. He knew that Bumpy could snap his fingers and the air would turn to lead. Finally, Bumpy folded the paper. He looked the kid in the eye. "You have something that belongs to the community," Bumpy said softly, "and you have a debt to pay for the inconvenience." The kid put the money on the table. Then he put his own watch. Then he put his own gun. Bumpy took the money. He left the gun. He stood up, tapped the table twice, and walked out. The kid never touched a weapon again. He moved to Jersey the next day. That was Bumpy. He could kill you with a bullet, sure, but he preferred to kill you with his presence. He defeated you psychologically before the first punch was thrown. This was the man the Italians were dealing with, the Genovese family, the Lucianos, the heavy hitters from downtown. They looked at Harlem and saw a gold mine. They saw that river of cash, and they wanted to divert it into their own pockets. They thought they could just march uptown and take it. They thought Harlem was just another territory to be conquered. But they hit a wall made of silence and loyalty. When an Italian soldier walked into a Harlem bar to demand protection money, the bartender didn't pay. He just called a number. And 10 minutes later, that soldier was being escorted back to the subway station by 3 men who didn't smile. Bumpy was the problem. He was the anomaly. He was the one piece on the board they couldn't buy, bully, or bribe. He was the checkmate. So, the commission made a decision. It was a cold business calculation discussed over espresso in a Little Italy social club. They couldn't beat him in the streets. He was too loved. They couldn't beat him in the courts. He was too smart. They had to erase him, and they knew they couldn't do it. Alone. You can't get close to a king unless you know the password to the castle. They needed a key. They needed someone on the inside, someone who sat at Bumpy's table, someone who knew his schedule, his secrets, and his blind spots. They needed a Judas. And in the summer of 1952, they found him. Betrayal never comes from the front. If it came from the front, it would just be a war. Betrayal has to come from the side. It has to come from the blind spot. It has to come from the hand that pours your coffee. In Bumpy Johnson's world, there was an inner circle, a steel ring of men who had been tested in fire, men who had done time in Dannemora, men who had kept their mouths shut when the police batons were cracking their ribs. But steel can rust, and the rust usually starts with a single drop of envy. His name was Silas. At least, that's what we'll call him. He was Bumpy's shadow. He was the man who sat in the front seat of the Lincoln while Bumpy sat in the back. He was the man who tasted the food before Bumpy took a bite. He was the man who held the umbrella when it rained, and that was the problem. He was tired of holding the umbrella. Silas was 35 years old. He was ambitious. He looked at Bumpy, a man approaching 50, a man who spent his evenings reading chess books and poetry, and he didn't see a genius. He saw a relic. He saw a ceiling that was keeping him down. The Italians saw it too. The Genovese family didn't recruit Silas with a gun. They recruited him with a mirror. It happened in the back room of a tailor shop on Broome Street, neutral ground. The air smelled of steam, mothballs, and the sharp chemical tang of dry cleaning fluid. Silas walked in alone. He was sweating, even though it was October. Sitting at a small table, surrounded by bolts of expensive fabric, was a capo from the Genovese family. Let's call him the Chin. The Chin didn't threaten Silas. He poured him a glass of sambuca. He offered him a cigar. He treated him like an equal, and that was the deadliest weapon of all. "Why?" the Chin asked, his voice sounding like dry leaves scraping on pavement. "Why does a lion take orders from a librarian? You do the work, you break the legs, you take the risks. And Bumpy? He takes the credit, he takes the envelope." Silas didn't say anything. He just stared at the sambuca. The clear liquid swirled in the glass, a little whirlpool of potential. The Chin leaned forward. The wooden chair creaked under his weight. He placed a heavy leather satchel on the table. It didn't make a thud. It made a solid, dense thwack. $50,000, the chin whispered, to start. And after, you run 116th Street. You run the numbers. You run the heroin. We just want a percentage. The crown is yours, kid. You just have to pick it up. Silas looked at the bag. Then he looked at the Italian. In that moment, loyalty didn't just die. It evaporated. It was replaced by the cold, hard calculus of greed. Silas realized that Bumpy Johnson was worth more to him dead than he was alive. The plan was set. It had to be clean. It had to look like an accident or a disappearance. No bodies in the street, no martyrs. The bait was a construction project on the west side, a new high-rise going up near the river. Bumpy had money in the unions. There was a dispute about the concrete contracts. It was a standard sit-down, just business. Bumpy had handled 1,000 meetings like it, but this time, Bumpy wouldn't be bringing his army. He would be bringing Silas. Because why would you need an army when you're with your brother? Fast forward to the day, the afternoon of the event. The car ride over was silent. The black Lincoln Continental glided down 125th Street, heading west toward the river. Bumpy was in the back reading a newspaper, checking the stock prices. He was calm. He was thinking about the future. In the front seat, Silas was gripping the steering wheel so hard the leather was groaning. He kept checking the rearview mirror, looking at Bumpy's eyes. He was looking for suspicion. He was looking for that famous intuition that had kept the king alive for 20 years. But Bumpy just turned the page. Rustle. That sound, the dry crinkle of newsprint, was the loudest thing in the car. They arrived at the site. The sun was setting, casting long, jagged shadows across the steel skeleton of the building. It was 20 stories of exposed girders and wind. The elevator wasn't working yet. They had to take the hoist, the open-air construction lift that rattled and shook as it climbed into the sky. The wind picked up as they rose. The city dropped away. The cars turned into ants. The Hudson River looked like a strip of gray lead. When the hoist stopped on the top floor, there were no union reps waiting. There were no contracts to sign. There were just 3 men in fedoras, standing by the edge, waiting. Bumpy stepped off the lift. He buttoned his jacket against the wind. He looked at the 3 men. He didn't know them, but he knew their suits. Sharkskin, Italian. He stopped. He didn't turn around. He just spoke to the air behind him. "Silas," Bumpy said. His voice was flat, disappointed. "You forgot the briefcase." Bumpy knew. In that split second, before a gun was drawn, before a fist was thrown, he knew. He didn't need to look back to know that Silas had stepped off the lift and blocked the exit. The trap had snapped shut. Bumpy turned around slowly. He looked at the boy he had raised from the gutter. He looked at the man he had trusted with his life. Silas wasn't holding an umbrella anymore. He was holding a .38 revolver, and he was shaking. "I'm sorry, Bumpy," Silas said, and his voice cracked like thin ice. "But the rent is due." Bumpy looked at the gun. Then he looked at the 3 Italians closing in from the sides. He looked at the 20-story drop behind him. He smiled, a cold, terrifying smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You didn't bring enough men, Silas," Bumpy whispered, and then the click. The universe is governed by laws, gravity, momentum, thermodynamics. But sometimes, in the space between a heartbeat and a muzzle flash, those laws are suspended. Sometimes, chaos takes the wheel. Silas squeezed the trigger. The hammer fell. Click. It wasn't a loud sound. In the roar of the wind whipping around the 20th floor, it should have been inaudible. But to the 5 men standing on that platform, it sounded like a crack of thunder, a bad primer, a speck of dirt in the chamber, a 50-cent mechanical failure that changed the course of American history. Silas stared at the gun. His eyes went wide, the pupils blowing out in sheer animal panic. For 1 second, he wasn't a gangster. He was a man who had just tried to kill a king and missed. And in that second, Bumpy Johnson moved. He didn't move like a man of 50. He moved like a coiled viper releasing its tension. He didn't run away. He stepped in. Bumpy lunged forward, his left hand, snatching the barrel of the revolver, diverting it away from his chest. His right hand, the hand that usually moved chess pieces, flashed. There was a silver blur. A switchblade pulled from his pocket and opened in a single fluid motion. Shh! The blade buried itself in Silas's forearm. Silas screamed. The gun clattered to the steel grating of the floor. But Bumpy wasn't fighting one man, he was fighting four. The three Italians, the sharks in sharkskin, swarmed him. They didn't have guns drawn. They had expected an execution, not a brawl. But they were heavy hitters. They were 200 pounds of muscle and violence. One of them, a brute with a broken nose, tackled Bumpy around the waist. They slammed into a pile of rebar. The breath rushed out of Bumpy's lungs in a pained grunt. He lost his grip on the knife. The fight was ugly. It wasn't cinematic. It was a desperate clawing struggle in the dark. It was elbows and knees. It was the smell of sweat and fear mixing with the metallic taste of blood. Bumpy gouged an eye. He bit an ear. He fought with the fury of a man who knows that if he stops moving, he dies. But math is math. 4 against 1. They dragged him up. They pinned his arms. They dragged him toward the ledge. This is the image that should have been the end. Bumpy Johnson, the King of Harlem, suspended over the abyss, his feet kicking at the empty air, the lights of the city spinning below him like a nauseating carousel. "Do it!" Silas screamed, clutching his bleeding arm. "Throw him!" The Italians heaved. Bumpy didn't beg. He didn't scream for help. He locked eyes with Silas one last time, and he spat blood into the traitor's face. Then they let go. Bumpy fell. He tumbled backward into the void. The wind roared in his ears. The steel skeleton of the building rushed past him. To the men on the roof, he was gone. They saw him disappear into the shadows of the girders below. They heard a sickening, heavy thud, the sound of a body hitting, something solid, followed by the clatter of loose debris falling all the way to the street. Silas ran to the edge. He peered over. It was pitch black down there. The wind was howling through the unfinished floors. He couldn't see the body, but he had heard the impact. No one survives a fall like that. No one. "He's done," one of the Italians said, breathless, straightening his tie. "Let's go. The cops will be here in 5. They wiped their hands. They picked up the gun. They got back into the hoist and began the long, rattling descent to the ground. They lit cigarettes. They started planning the celebration. But 20 feet down, in the darkness of the 18th floor, there was a sound, a groan, a low, guttural sound of agony. Bumpy hadn't hit the street. He hadn't hit the concrete. As he fell, flailing in the dark, his arm had hooked around a protruding steel I-beam. It was a miracle of reflex and adrenaline. The impact had nearly ripped his arm out of its socket. His ribs had slammed against the cold steel, cracking 2 of them instantly. He was dangling there, one hand gripping the frozen metal, his legs swinging over 500 feet of nothing. The pain was blinding. White-hot lightning shooting up his shoulder. Every instinct in his brain was screaming at him to let go, to end the pain. But Bumpy Johnson didn't let go. He gritted his teeth so hard a molar cracked. He swung his legs up. He hooked a heel over the beam. He pulled. He clawed. He dragged his broken body onto the narrow steel girder. He lay there for a minute, gasping for air, the cold wind drying the sweat on his forehead. He listened to the sound of the hoist going down. Clank, clank, clank. He listened to the men laughing as they reached the ground. Bumpy rolled over. He looked up at the night sky. He was alive. And now, the game had changed. The pieces had been reset. Silas thought he had just won the kingdom. He didn't realize that all he had done was wake the dragon. Bumpy checked his watch. The crystal was shattered, but the mechanism was still ticking. It was 8:15 p.m. He had broken ribs. He had a dislocated shoulder. He had no weapon. But he had something better. He had time. He pulled himself up. He found the service stairs. He began the long, painful walk down 20 flights of stairs. With every step, the pain sharpened his mind. With every step, the plan formed. They thought he was dead. Good. Because dead men don't have to follow the rules. The first hour of a war is the most dangerous, not because of the violence, but because of the information gap. It was 8:45 p.m. Bumpy Johnson emerged from the alleyway behind the construction site. He was a ruin of a man. His suit was shredded, stained with grease and rust. His left arm hung uselessly at his side, the shoulder joint dislocated, throbbing with a pulse that felt like a hammer striking an anvil. He walked with a limp, favoring his cracked ribs. But he didn't stop. He merged into the shadows of the West Side, becoming just another silhouette in a city of millions. He passed a newsstand. He passed a jazz club where the doorman was already whispering the news of his death. Bumpy heard it. He heard his own obituary being written in real time on the street corners. They got him. Bumpy's gone. He didn't correct them. He didn't step into the light and say, "I am here." Because in the underworld, being dead is a tactical advantage. When your enemies think you are a ghost, they stop looking over their shoulders. They lower their shields. They get drunk on victory. Bumpy needed that hour. He needed 60 minutes of invisibility to reset the board. He didn't go home. He didn't go to the Flash Inn. He knew Silas would have men watching those doors, waiting to pick off the mourners. Instead, Bumpy went to a place where no one asks questions. He went to a funeral home on 138th Street. The back door was unlocked. It was a professional courtesy. The owner, a man named Mr. Tate, owed Bumpy a debt that went back 20 years. Bumpy stumbled into the embalming room. The air was cold, smelling of formaldehyde, lilies, and silence. Mr. Tate was working on a body. He looked up, saw the bleeding, broken man standing in the doorway, and he didn't gasp. He didn't ask what happened. He simply put down his instruments, walked over, and locked the door. For the next 20 minutes, there were no words. There was just the sickening pop of a shoulder being forced back into its socket. There was the stinging hiss of iodine being poured over open cuts. There was the tight wrapping of bandages around a cracked rib cage. Bumpy sat on a metal stool, shirtless, sweating through the pain. He looked like a boxer in the final round, battered, bruised, but his eyes were two burning coals in a pile of ash. At 9:15 p.m., Bumpy made one phone call. He didn't call the foot soldiers. He didn't call the numbers runners. He called the old guard. These were men the streets had forgotten, men in ATBers, their late 40s and 50s, men who had retired from the game, who ran hardware stores and pigeon coops now. But deep down, they were still the same wolves who had fought the Dutch Schultz Wars in the 30s. He gave them a location. He gave them a code word. The wind is blowing. By 9:30 p.m., the basement of that funeral home was a war room. 4 men stood around a steel table. They weren't wearing sharkskin suits. They were wearing work clothes, overalls, leather jackets. They looked like mechanics. But the tools they were unpacking weren't for fixing cars. There's a specific sound that happens when men prepare for a massacre. It's a rhythmic, mechanical music. Clack, clack, the sound of a Remington 870 pump-action shotgun being assembled. Shh. The sound of a rag dipped in gun oil sliding down the barrel of a Thompson submachine gun. Glug, glug. The sound of gasoline being poured into milk bottles, followed by the stuffing of a kerosene-soaked rag into the neck. Bumpy watched them. He was dressed in a fresh pair of coveralls provided by the undertaker. He was testing the weight of a heavy iron pipe in his good hand. He didn't want a gun tonight. He wanted to feel the impact. He wanted Silas to know it was him. The mood in the room wasn't angry. It was professional. It was the quiet focus of surgeons scrubbing in before an operation. They knew the odds. They knew that the Italians had an army. They knew that Silas had the element of surprise. But Bumpy had the element of rage. And rage, when distilled and focused, is the most powerful fuel on earth. He looked at the clock on the wall. 9:45 p.m. The rumors outside were reaching a fever pitch. The city was mourning. The Italians were celebrating. Bumpy picked up a shotgun. He pumped it once. The sound echoed off the tile walls like a gavel striking a bench. "Gentlemen," Bumpy said, his voice a low growl, "they want a funeral. Let's give them one." The most dangerous time in a war is the silence before, the counterattack. That moment when the enemy thinks they have won and the survivors just checking the ammo. What's the craziest survival story you've ever heard? A moment where someone should have been dead but kept coming? Tell me in the comments below. I read every single one. 10 p.m. The second hour of a crisis is different from the first. The first hour is chaos. It's the car crash. It's the scream. But the second hour is when the adrenaline fades, leaving behind a cold, sweating sickness in the stomach. It's the hour of the wolf. On the streets of Harlem, the mourning had turned into a strange, vibrating tension. The weeping had stopped. The shutters were down. The neighborhood felt like a pressure cooker with the valve welded shut. The police, the 28th precinct, were notably absent. Their patrol cars were parked deep in the garage. The captain had received a call from downtown. Stay away. Tonight is for the cleaners, but the cleaners were about to become the stain. Out of the garage of the funeral home on 138th Street rolled a vehicle that fit the night perfectly. A 1948 Cadillac hearse. Black as a raven's wing, polished to a mirror shine, it moved slowly down the avenue, obeying every traffic light. To a passerby, it looked like just another late-night pickup for a poor soul who passed in their sleep. But inside that hearse, there was no corpse. Bumpy Johnson sat in the passenger seat. The pain in his ribs was a dull, rhythmic throb, keeping time with the engine. In the back, where the casket usually rested, sat 3 men on the floorboards. They were holding shotguns across their knees. They weren't speaking. They were watching the city roll by through the velvet-curtained windows. They saw the fear on the faces of the people. They saw the Genovese soldiers standing openly on the corners of 116th Street, laughing, twirling their batons, acting like they had just bought the block. Bumpy watched them too. He memorized their faces. He memorized their positions. He was marking targets. Meanwhile, 3 miles south, in the VIP booth of the Blue Velvet Lounge, the celebration was hitting its peak. Silas was on his 4th whiskey. His arm, the one Bumpy had slashed, was bandaged under his expensive suit jacket, but it burned. He was trying to smile. He was trying to be the man of the hour. The Chin was sitting across from him, peeling a lemon twist for his espresso. The Chin was in a good mood. He was talking about expansion. He was talking about how they would double the price of heroin in Harlem by Christmas. "You did good, kid," the Chin said, pointing the lemon peel at Silas. "You did what had to be done. The king is dead. Long live the king." Silas raised his glass. "Long live the king," he mumbled, but his hand was shaking. The ice cubes clinked against the glass. Ching, ching. Because Silas knew Bumpy. He knew that Bumpy was a cat with 9 lives, and deep down, in the reptilian, part of his brain, he was waiting for the phone to ring. And at 10:12 p.m., it rang. The bartender picked it up. He listened for a second, his face going pale. He walked over to the booth and handed the receiver to the Chin. "It's the cleanup crew," the bartender whispered. "From the construction site." The Chin took the phone. He was annoyed. Why were they calling? They were just supposed to bag the body and toss it in the foundation of the new bridge. "Yeah?" the Chin barked. "Is it done?" Silas stopped drinking. He watched the Chin's face. He saw the arrogance drain out of the Italian's eyes like water from a cracked tub. He saw the pupils contract. He saw the jaw go slack. "What do you mean?" the Chin whispered. "What do you mean gone?" The silence at the table was sudden and absolute. The music in the club seemed to fade away. The Chin listened for another 10 seconds. Then he slammed the phone down so hard the plastic cracked. He looked at Silas. His eyes weren't friendly anymore. They were the eyes of a man who realizes he has been sold a defective parachute. "They went down to the alley," the Chin said, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. "There's blood. There's a crater in the dirt where he hit, but there's no body." Silas felt the room spin. The whiskey churned in his gut. "He crawled away," Silas whispered. "Oh, God," he crawled away. "Crawled?" The Chin stood up, overturning the table. The espresso cup shattered. "A man falls 20 stories. He doesn't crawl. He's supposed to be hamburger meat." "You don't know him," Silas stammered, backing away. "You don't know him like I do. If he's not dead, if he's breathing—" "Shut up!" the Chin screamed. "He's one man, one broken man against an army. Lock the doors. Get the boys. If he shows his face, we cut it off." But it was too late for locks. Because at that exact moment, the black hearse was pulling up to the curb outside. The engine cut. The headlights turned off. Inside the car, Bumpy Johnson checked his watch. 10:15 p.m. The second hour was over. The mourning period was finished. He looked at his men in the back. He didn't give a speech. He didn't yell, "Charge." He just racked the slide of his shotgun. Clack, clack. "Let's go pay the rent," Bumpy said. The doors of the hearse swung open, and the explosion began. Physics tells us that an explosion is just a rapid expansion of energy. But in the underworld, an explosion is what happens when you compress a man like Bumpy Johnson for too long and then remove the lid. 10:17 p.m. The doorman at the Blue Velvet Lounge was a giant named Luca. He had spent the last hour turning away locals, sneering at them, telling them that the club was under new management. He was checking his fingernails when he saw the hearse. He didn't understand it. A hearse doesn't double park. Then he saw the passenger door open. He saw a boot hit the pavement. Then a leg in oil-stained coveralls. Then a torso wrapped in bloody bandages. And finally, the face. Luca's brain short-circuited. He was looking at a dead man. He opened his mouth to shout, to warn the men inside, but the sound never came out, because the back window of the hearse rolled down. A hand emerged, holding a milk bottle stuffed with a rag. The rag was burning with a frantic orange flame. The arm swung. The bottle sailed through the air in a perfect, lazy arc. It rotated end over end, the fire illuminating the rain like a falling star. It smashed through the plate glass window of the Blue Velvet. Crash. The sound of the glass breaking was the starting pistol. Inside the club, the bottle hit the polished mahogany dance floor and shattered. Gasoline sprayed everywhere, onto the velvet curtains, onto the tablecloths, onto the suits of the wise guys. Whoosh! The room didn't just catch fire, it inhaled it. A wall of orange flame erupted, separating the front of the club from the back. The heat was instantaneous and blistering. It sucked the oxygen right out of the room. The music died. The screams began. Men who had been laughing 10 seconds ago were now scrambling over tables, knocking over chairs, desperate to get away from the inferno at the front door. But the front door was the only way out. And standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the streetlights, was the Grim Reaper. Bumpy Johnson walked through the broken glass. He stepped right over the burning threshold. The flames licked at his boots, but he didn't look down. He raised the Remington 870 shotgun. Inside the smoke-filled room, the Chin was trying to pull a pistol from his shoulder holster. His hands were slick with sweat and panic. He aimed at the silhouette in the fire. Boom! Bumpy didn't aim. He didn't have to. The shotgun blast caught the Chin in the chest, lifting him off his feet and throwing him back into the liquor shelves. Bottles of scotch and gin exploded, showering the room in glass and alcohol, feeding the fire even more. The smell of the room changed instantly. It went from perfume and gasoline to the copper tang of blood and the acrid stench of gunpowder. Silas was cowering behind an overturned table. He was watching his new world burn down around him. He saw the Chin go down. He saw the other soldiers scrambling, coughing, firing wild shots into the smoke. Silas scrambled on his hands and knees, trying to make it to the kitchen door. He was crying. He was hyperventilating. He was a rat trapped in a burning maze. He reached the kitchen door. He grabbed the handle. It was locked. He pounded on it. He screamed, "Open up! Open the door!" He turned around. Through the haze of black smoke, he saw Bumpy. The king was moving slowly, limping heavily on his bad leg. He wasn't running. He was inevitable. He pumped the shotgun. Clack, clack. The sound cut through the roar of the fire. Bumpy stopped 10 feet away. The heat was intense now. The paint was peeling off the ceiling. The sprinklers hadn't triggered yet. It was just the two of them in the center of hell. Silas slumped against the door. He held up his hands. They were shaking so hard, he looked like he was vibrating. "Bumpy," Silas choked out, tears streaming down his face. "Please, they made me. They forced me." Bumpy lowered the shotgun. For a second, Silas thought he saw mercy. He thought he saw the father figure who had paid for his mother's funeral. But Bumpy wasn't looking at Silas. He was looking at the gold watch on Silas's wrist, the watch Bumpy had given him for his 30th birthday. Bumpy reached into his pocket. He didn't pull a weapon. He pulled out a single chess piece, a black pawn. He tossed it. It bounced off Silas's chest and landed on the floor. "You tried to take the king," Bumpy said, his voice barely audible over the roar of the flames. "But you forgot to check the board." Bumpy raised the shotgun one last time. Silas screamed, "Boom!" The impact was absolute. The betrayal was settled. But this wasn't just about one room. This wasn't just about one bar. At the exact same moment, 3 miles away, 2 other cars were pulling up to 2 other Italian social clubs. On 116th Street, a Molotov cocktail sailed into the window of the Palermo Club. On Pleasant Avenue, a black sedan rolled past a gambling den run by the Profazzi crew. 4 shotguns emerged from the windows. Boom, boom, boom. Harlem didn't just push back, it exploded. In the span of 5 minutes, 3 of the Genovese family's most profitable operations were turned into bonfires. The message was being written in smoke across the skyline of Manhattan. Back at the Blue Velvet, the fire sirens were finally wailing in the distance. The heat was becoming unbearable. The roof was starting to groan. Bumpy Johnson turned around. He didn't run. He walked back toward the front door, stepping over the debris, stepping through the fire. He walked out onto the sidewalk. The cool night air hit his face. The rain was sizzling on the hot pavement. We looked at the doorman, Luca, who was still standing there, frozen in terror. Bumpy stopped. He adjusted his collar, wincing at the pain in his ribs. He looked at Luca with that one good eye, the other one swollen shut. "Tell them," Bumpy whispered. He didn't say what to tell them. He didn't have to. He got back into the hearse. The door closed. The heavy Cadillac pulled away from the curb, disappearing into the rainy night just as the first fire truck turned the corner. Behind him, the Blue Velvet Lounge collapsed inward, a pile of burning timber and shattered ambition. The rumor of his death had lasted exactly 2 hours. The legend of his resurrection would last forever. Morning in Harlem didn't break that Sunday. It bruised. The sun dragged itself up over the East River, gray and sickly, illuminating a neighborhood that smelled like a wet ashtray. The rain had stopped, but the streets were slick with a mixture of water, soot, and the runoff from the fire hoses. On 112th Street, the Blue Velvet Lounge was gone. It wasn't just closed, it was erased. The building stood like a rotten tooth in the jaw of the block. The roof had collapsed inward. The windows were jagged, blackened eyes staring out at the sidewalk. A thin, gray column of smoke was still rising from the rubble, twisting into the sky like a warning signal that could be seen from the Brooklyn Bridge. At 7 a.m., the scene was a silent theater of destruction. A single NYPD cruiser sat idling across the street. 2 detectives in trench coats stood on the sidewalk, drinking coffee that tasted like paper cups. They weren't looking for clues. They weren't dusting for prints. They were just watching the smoke. One of them, a veteran detective who had worked the Harlem precinct since the 30s, kicked a piece of charred wood with the toe of his boot. He looked at the ruin, then he looked at his partner. He didn't say a word. He just shook his head and closed his notebook. They knew. Every cop in the 28th precinct knew. This wasn't arson. This wasn't an insurance job. This was a receipt. The official police report would later list the cause of the fire as faulty wiring. It would list the deaths of Silas and the Italian associates as unidentified victims of a structural collapse. That is the power of Bumpy Johnson. He didn't just control the numbers, he controlled the narrative. He made the police accomplices to his silence. The NYPD knew that arresting Bumpy for this would be like trying to arrest a hurricane. It would only cause more damage. So they did what they always did. They let the jungle govern itself. But while the police were washing their hands of the ashes, the real shockwave was hitting 3 miles south. Down in Little Italy, the morning was terrifyingly quiet. Usually, Sunday is a loud day on Mulberry Street, church bells, families arguing over lunch, the noise of life. But today, the social clubs were tombs. The Genovese hierarchy had received the news at dawn. They didn't get a phone call from Bumpy. They didn't get a letter. They got the morning paper. There was no headline about a gang war. There was no mention of the failed hit on the construction site. There was just a small blurb on page 4 about a fire in a Harlem nightclub. And that terrified them more than a threat. It meant that Bumpy had cleaned the board. He had killed their men, burned their fortress, and erased the evidence all before breakfast. And he had done it with the efficiency of a phantom. The Dons sat in their high-backed chairs, realizing they had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They had treated Bumpy like a thug. They forgot he was a strategist. They had tried to checkmate a man who had already memorized the next 20 moves. By noon, the order went out from the commission to every soldier in the 5 boroughs: stay out of Harlem. The checkpoints were abandoned, the collection bags were left empty. The Italians pulled back behind 96th Street as if they had hit an invisible electric fence. They realized that the cost of doing business in Bumpy Johnson's territory was too high. The tax wasn't money. The tax was blood. And up in Harlem? The fear from the night before had evaporated. It was replaced by a strange, grim pride. The shopkeepers opened their shutters. The church ladies walked past the burnt-out shell of the blue velvet and nodded their heads. They saw the ruin not as a tragedy, but as a monument. It was a scar on the street that said, "We are protected." Bumpy Johnson didn't come out that day. There were no victory parades. He was back in the shadows, probably sitting in the back room of the Flash Inn, icing his ribs, watching the smoke drift past his window. He had sent his message. You can push a man, you can rob a man, you can even try to kill a man, but you never, ever try to humiliate a king. The smoke over Lenox Avenue eventually cleared. The rubble was hauled away. But the memory of that night, the night the sky turned orange, settled into the concrete. It became part of the mythology of the city. The Italians never tried to throw Bumpy Johnson off a roof again. In fact, for the next 15 years, they barely whispered his name without looking over their shoulders. They had learned the hard way. If you strike at the king, you better make sure he hits the ground. Legends aren't written in ink, they are written in scar tissue. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson lived for another 16 years after that night. He survived Alcatraz. He survived the federal government. He survived the changing of the guard in the heroin trade. But in the barbershops of 125th Street, the old men still talk about the night of the falling king. They don't talk about the politics or the money. They talk about the physics. They talk about a man who was pushed off a cliff and somehow learned to fly before he hit the ground. That night changed the DNA of the Harlem underworld. Before the roof, Bumpy was a gangster. After the roof, he was a myth. When you look a man in the eye who has survived a 20-story drop, you don't see a human being. You see something unnatural. You see a force that death itself has rejected. The Italians understood this. That's why the war stopped. They realized that you can fight a man, but you cannot fight a ghost. And Bumpy had become a living ghost. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life. A subtle hitch in his step, a permanent reminder of the I-beam that caught him in the dark. But he never hid it. He wore that limp like a medal. It was the sound of his survival, tapping out a rhythm on the pavement that said, "I am still here." And what of the click? That tiny mechanical failure. A 50-cent spring and a cheap revolver that refused to snap, a piece of metal smaller than a fingernail. Historians will tell you that the civil rights movement, the drug wars, and the rise of the black mafia were shaped by socio-political forces. But we know the truth. We know that the history of New York City turned on a microscopic piece of grit in a gun chamber. If that gun had fired, Harlem burns in a riot of grief. The Italians take over. The heroin epidemic starts 10 years earlier. The world looks different, but the gun didn't fire. And in that millisecond of silence, Bumpy Johnson found the clarity he needed to burn the world down and build it back up in his own image. He taught us that power isn't about never falling. Power is about what you grab onto when you fall. It's about the refusal to let gravity have the final say. Some men are made of glass. When they hit the bottom, they shatter. Bumpy Johnson was made of iron. When he hit the bottom, he rang like a bell. And the sound of that bell is still ringing in the streets today. The history books will tell you the dates. They will tell you the arrests. But they won't tell you about the smell of the smoke on 112th Street. They won't tell you about the sound of the wind on the 20th floor. And they certainly won't tell you about the click. But we just did. If you want more stories from the shadows, stories that the FBI files tried to bury, hit that subscribe button. Turn on notifications, because the king might be gone, but the board is still set. This is Untold Mafia Stories. See you in the next chapter.